Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Goes Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if the Mongols invaded Japan? Now, this video, I know a lot of people have been waiting for a long time. I've been saying that it's going to come for a long time. It's finally here. I know you're all waiting for it. So, before we kind of get into the alternative history, what we're going to do, as we always do, is give a bit of like historical context, just so you kind of understand what like this moment was, and just understand that the long-term ramifications of it. So for those who don't know, Genghis Khan conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen until the British showed up. We won. But yeah, the largest empire that the world had ever seen at that point. And basically his descendants ruled over a vast empire, stretching all the way from the Pacific to basically the borderlands of Europe. And Kublai Khan was one of his descendants, and he had his eyes set on Japan. So Goryeo, which was, later to become Korea, they had recently accepted vassalage. So vassalage is basically where you don't invade a country, but basically they are your, don't want to swear for the YouTube algorithm, but basically they are your female dog. So basically you have to kind of, whatever you do, they basically have to kind of follow along. It's an unbalanced kind of relationship, basically. And this is what like Kublai Khan wanted for the Japanese. And so he sent a letter to the Japanese emperor, which was very insulting. Talking about, Kublai Khan and the Japanese emperor, talking about their relationship as if they're father and son. And it also didn't help that within that letter, at the end of it, there was a kind of thinly veiled threat of basically, if you don't agree to vassalage, we will come and invade you. So the Japanese emperor did not agree to this at all. And so the Mongols decided to invade. So in 1274, the Mongols invaded Japan, and they managed to conquer a few islands along the way, and then landed a force of about 30,000 men on the Japanese coast. Now, the Japanese outnumbered the invaders, and so they were able to basically push them back to the sea, back to their ships in the famous Battle of Bunei. I think that's how you pronounce it. So anyway, they ended up being pushed back onto their ships, and just at this point, there was a typhoon that ended up sweeping through and destroyed a large swathe of the Mongol fleet. So much so that of the 30,000 invaders who went to Japan, 13,500 did not return. Now, not all of this was as a result of this so-called divine wind, or as the Japanese call it, kamikaze. Pay attention for that later, because we will be obviously going into depth on that. But yeah, not everyone was destroyed by this divine wind. Obviously, a number of them were killed by the Japanese defenders as well. But this basically tied in a lot to the national mythology of Japan, like the Japan's national identity. So one of the major things about this, when we think about Japan, we think about the samurai, right? So the samurai were obviously a warrior class, and a lot of the mythology that they had, for lack of a better word, came from this moment, like a lot of things were very much influenced by this invasion. In particular, like the concept of Zen and Bushido had huge influences on what would become samurai culture. And during this time, there's like a nice little story, which kind of like sums this up. So you had a local ruler in Japan called Tokimune. I'm gonna butcher his name. I don't need loads of people in the comment section correcting me on how to say his name. One person correct me on how to say his name, and that's it, okay? So Tokimune, basically he was scared because obviously the Mongols were the enemy right at the gates as such. And basically he went to his Zen master, who was called Buku, and Buku basically said, okay, chill out, dude, just go off and meditate, okay? Just chill. So when he came back from his meditation, Buku asked him, how will you face your fears? And Tokimune answered with a very clear, katsu, which, in Japanese roughly means victory. I don't really understand why you got chicken katsu, because it doesn't mean chicken victory. I don't know why it's got the same word, whatever. But anyway, he said katsu, that's what you need to know. And Buku, in response to this, said, it is time for the son of the lion to roar as the lion. So, this is, this like story is like really pivotal in terms of the formation of, samurai culture and stuff, right? So this idea of how do you face your fears? Victory, okay? A little bit simplistic, but it's a good kind of mentality to have and stuff, So in life in general, like if you've got any fears, how do you face it? Victory, right? So you do everything you can just to win, right? So the invasion of 1274 was obviously a massive disaster for the Mongols. And so what they did is repeated the same mistake, this time just on a bigger scale. So in 1281, Kublai Khan had sent more and more letters to the Japanese emperor, and even had sent some emissaries to basically try and persuade him to accept vassalage. Yeah, these emissaries all got beheaded, and so enraged by this, Kublai Khan decided he was going to invade Japan, not just through one pronged attack, but he was going to do a two-pronged attack. So recently he had invaded the Song dynasty in southern China. So the idea was that he was going to send a force of troops from Korea and then a force of troops from southern China. So the plan was for these numbers I'm about to say now are highly, highly questionable. I just want to say that before I even say this, right? 40,000 troops from Korea and 100,000 troops from southern China. Now, many different historians looking into these figures estimate that they might have exaggerated these 140,000 by either a factor of 2 or a factor of 10, because this is medieval times. Like, to get this many people on the boats and the logistics of it is just a nightmare. More likely than not, these figures are highly, highly exaggerated, but for argument's sake, let's just run with them. So the Mongols invaded with this two-pronged attack, and what happened yet again was they landed, they got pushed back to their ships, and yet again, another typhoon hit. This time, even more devastating than the first one, right? So even when you look at Chinese sources, Mongol sources, Korean sources, as well as obviously Japanese sources, right? They estimate that anywhere between 60 and 80% of the force was completely destroyed, right? So however large that force is, we can have a debate about that. Regardless, about 60 to 80% of them were wiped out by this typhoon. So this is completely devastating, right? This basically destroyed the Mongol navy, and Kublai Khan after this point was like, okay, take the hint now. I'm not gonna try and invade Japan again. Yeah, we're just gonna let sleeping dogs lie. Just. So that's basically what ended up happening. Yeah. So the Japanese, as a result of this, were free from the Mongol invasion, and Kublai Khan just kind of basically stayed in mainland Asia. But what would have been the effect if the Mongols had actually invaded, right? This is what we're going to look into in this alternative history. So first off, I want to give a massive shout out to What If Alt His channel is really much an inspiration. When it comes to the alternative history part of my channel, his channel is kind of what I look to as the gold standard. And some of the videos he's done in particular, I might misquote the exact title of it, but he did one on what if the Mongols invaded Europe. And in that video, he basically outlined what happened when the Mongols invaded different countries, right? So when you look at places like Russia, places like China, Persia, the effect of the Mongol invasion was huge. First of all, you had a huge body count, right? Except for communist dictators, the Mongols are high up there in terms of mass murderers of all history, right? You're talking tens of millions of people dead. So basically, if Japan had been invaded, first of all, you can expect mountains and mountains of dead bodies, right? That's almost a complete certainty, especially with this much larger force that they had in 1281, combined with the fact of obviously you've already beaten them once, you've cut off the head of their emissaries, you've insulted Kublai Khan, etc., etc. This second time, they basically would have just, completely leveled Japan, right? So this would have had a devastating effect on the Japanese, but also something really to note is the effect it had psychologically on countries that were invaded, right? So if you've been invaded by an outside force, and that outside force has completely destroyed you and completely just completely humiliated you, what ends up happening is that when that invading force eventually gets kicked out, what ends up happening is that the country ends up becoming, uber conservative, and ends up becoming very isolationist and very inward looking, and trying to re-find what is left of its kind of culture and its kind of national story, right? So this is kind of what you see in multiple different countries, whether it's China, you see it in Russia. Russia before the Mongols was very pluralistic, it was very democratic, had strong property rights, it traded a lot with Europe. After the Mongol invasion, it became very isolationist and very inward looking and very autocratic. Many people outside of Japan are completely ignorant of the fact that between 1603 to 1854, Japan imposed upon itself Self-isolation, right? So basically, all foreigners were banned apart from the Dutch, who were able to come in just through the port of Nagasaki. So everyone else, whether it be priests or like any other people and stuff, right? If they were caught on Japan, they'd be executed. Even like Japanese fishermen who went a bit too far away from the coast would be executed. So basically, Japan really it self-isolated itself, right? It's kind of, it proper went into like lockdown for like almost 250 years. So Japan did that in our own timeline without this Mongol invasion. So imagine if Japan had been invaded by the Mongols and the Mongols had come in, wiped out, huge amounts of their cities, killed like millions of people. How would Japan have really felt about this, like moving forward? Like when the Mongols eventually left, how would they have perceived the outside world? Well, Japan up until that point had never been invaded. So this would have been a massive psychological scar to the Japanese, right? And we'll talk about like the effect of like World War II in a little bit, but like that's kind of, it would have been absolutely devastating. So Japan, in our own timeline, like I said, isolated itself for 250 years without the Mongol invasion. If they had been invaded, what's to say that that self-isolation might not have gone on for maybe 600 years? Yeah, like because obviously when like the Americans forced them to come out of isolation in 1854, basically at the barrel of like a gunboat, that was a big psychological like shock for the Japanese, right? But they were still able to kind of like bounce back from that. However, if that isolation was twice as long as it was in our own timeline, what's to say that they would have been able to industrialize as quickly? What's to say that they would have had the same kind of mindset? Yeah, because they would have been really, really like inward looking at this point. They would have been, so far behind like the rest of the world because there have been so little like trade and connection with the rest of the world. And so, yeah, Japan would be, it would be like completely different from what it is now. A lot of Japan's like culture kind of like stemmed from that period of isolation, and that's why even today, up until very recently, the Japanese haven't allowed many like immigrants to come to their country. They now have to because of the demographic time bomb, which is basically they have far too many old people and not enough young people to look after them. But even still, they're very hesitant to allow outsiders to come into their country, and I think that this would have been even more so, if that's even possible, for it to be more ramped up than it currently is. They would have viewed the whole rest of the outside world as, as a massive threat to them. So even when the Americans come in 1854, they would have basically seen them as like the Mongols part two. So would they have been as accepting of them? Probably not. The Americans might have had to invade. I don't know. It's very, very complicated as to what would have happened. Especially when you talk about something which happened like so long ago. But fast forward now to World War II, and you can see just the impact of this victory by the Japanese, against the Mongols. So the Japanese went into World War II being far too hubristic, right? They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and yet they still wanted to go to war with America, the British Empire, and they had already been at war with China. And any reasonable country would have basically looked at this and be like, this is not going to work out, we're going to be invaded. But because the Japanese were, indoctrinated with this idea of, there'll be a divine wind and that, and all this kind of samurai stuff and all this kind of this mythology of we've never been invaded in 3,000 years, they basically thought that they were invincible. Even to the point of thinking the Allies wouldn't be able to bomb Tokyo and stuff because they wouldn't even be able to enter Japanese airspace. It's just completely irrational and completely hubristic, and it can only come from the legacy of this kind of hundreds of years of really focusing on this pivotal moment and stuff, right? And also as well, we only think about kamikaze pilots. Where does that name come from? Kamikaze, divine wind. This idea that if there's not going to be a typhoon that's going to wipe out the Americans, we will be that typhoon. We will basically fly planes into their ships and into their troops and stuff, and we will basically defend the homeland from invasion. It's completely irrational. And if they had been defeated by the Mongols, probably World War II in the Pacific would have been completely different. Maybe they would have invaded China, but they wouldn't have been silly enough, I don't think, to have gone to war with the Americans and with the British Empire. Even if they were distracted by the war in Europe, they probably still would have been, they would have chilled out a lot. So if you think about that, like the huge impact that that has on world history, and especially on Japanese history, yeah, so pretty much all of this would have been completely different. And that's something to really kind of bear in mind here, that like something which happened almost what, like 700 years ago can still have a massive, massive impact on the world we live in today. So, I hope that you really enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button. We're really promoting the Patreon account that we have. You know, don't forget, like, obviously, if you do donate to that, you'll get a shout out in the video. It's now my full-time job doing this, and so yeah, that's what I'm really trying to like push for, because this is how I'm gonna make my living basically. We've got a whole lot more kind of like things coming and stuff. And as we discussed in our previous video where we're talking about like, you know, we're finally monetized now. So slowly we're trying to build up there and stuff. But yeah, definitely stay tuned for next time, where we're going to be talking about the Iranian Revolution. So basically, what if the Iran never had its revolution in 1979? So talking about like the Ayatollah, talking about the Shah, talking about all that kind of stuff, and then going into like the modern day geopolitics of the Middle East and trying to like figure out how things would kind of be different. So that's what we're going to discuss next time. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.